Okay, I imagine you've looked at this first slide long enough. So in this hour, we're going to go through several topics. We're going to cover raptor identification. Now, nowhere is it going to ever be enough for some people. So there's no substitute for being out in the field watching raptors. Winter is a great time. We don't have all of our species here, but you can really get good looks at some of the species in winter. Then we're going to cover why the numbers we see seem to be changing and some clues about what's happening to raptor populations because they're not all the same. Some are doing extremely well, like Cooper's hawk. They're actually increasing. Some are declining, and we'll try to unpack some of that, right? So identifying and learning about raptors during migration especially is our goal tonight. Although there's much information to share, please remember these central concepts. Although we'll use a number of published and online resources, again, there's no substitute for getting out into the field and actually studying the birds out there. Many field guides are useful for identifying a perched raptor, but the birds, when they're in flight, look kind of different. I have many people who are beginning birders tell me, they can't figure out all the different plumages and, because the lighting conditions vary so much, the birds can be really confusing. So we'll try to get rid of some of that confusion for you. So here's some critical steps for you to make during your first couple minutes. Look for shape and the pattern of areas of light and dark plumage on a bird, in an individual bird, right away, because you often have less than 30 or 40 seconds to assess this information. So you should, make yourself do that right away when you see one. How do you identify them? Well, there's 6 or 7 pathways through that. Variable size, although sometimes that can be difficult to. Shape is probably the most useful single characteristic. Color pattern, markings, the behavior of the bird, what kind of habitat you're in, and then occasionally, although it's not really very useful for most raptors because during migration, they're not calling. They don't have any reason to. So learning these silhouettes is really useful. And, you can find silhouettes in a lot of field guides. Remember, though, that birds, they kind of change their posture. A big broad-winged hawk like a red tail, sometimes when it's gliding, it actually makes its wings look kind of falcon-like. So if it's a long way away, it can really be tricky. Here are the basic groups, these 7 groups, but the middle one on the right is not one that we see very often in Wisconsin. Vultures, for the most part, 99.5% of the vultures you see in Wisconsin are turkey vultures. We hardly ever get any others. We have 2 species of eagles. One is much less common than the other. We have 4 relatively common buteos. We have 3 accipiters. One of those is not common at all. We have 3 basic falcons, and then every once in a rare while, there'll be a 4th or a 5th one thrown in there. You can occasionally get a kite in Wisconsin, but all of them, whenever they show up here, they're very rare. Others would include things like the northern harrier. It doesn't really fit in any of those other groups. So among vultures, that bird on the left, that's a classic turkey vulture. The body's all black. The wing linings are very black. And the flight feathers, both the primaries and the secondaries, from underneath look kind of silvery, right? Even from a great distance. If you look over on that right-hand side, you'll see there's a couple of other vultures thrown in there. but black vulture is something that we only see in Wisconsin about every, there's maybe one or two every 2 or 3 or 4 years, no more often than that. Maybe there was a California condor in the Midwest if you went back 300 years, but no people, either native people or white people, have seen one in the Midwest in at least 200 years. So just cross that one off the list. Here's eagles. By far, the most common one is the bald eagle. There's a bunch of different plumages that you should get to know, but then golden eagles are actually a little bit more common than you might think, although it's more likely that you'll see them in some areas of the state during fall and winter than you will anywhere else. So we don't see very many of them here on the eastern half of the state. Golden eagles are much more abundant, and I'm not calling them abundant. I'm just saying they're more abundant in the southwestern part of the state in the driftless area. They like that habitat better, and they're just more common there. That doesn't mean you couldn't see one here, because every so often we do get one on various raptor watchers in the eastern part of the state. So if you're looking at a really big bird of prey with big, long wings, and you've decided you're looking at an eagle, well, how do you separate the two? First of all, look at the relative size of the head and the bill. So you can see that second or third year bald eagle on the left got a really big head and a really big bill. The next sort of pictures I show you, you'll see that even better. On the right, that's a golden eagle, has a smaller head and a smaller bill. So really try to remember those things. They can kind of stick out if you get a good enough look. And then look for the white in the underside of the wing and underside of the tail. Now, that bird on the left, it's got kind of white mottling all through the underwing and white mottled tail feathers. There isn't very much white at all in that bird on the right. That's a bird tending towards being an adult. So it's probably at least 3 years old, doesn't have much white in its plumage at all anymore. So that bird again on the left, see the huge bill and big head. That is an 1 or 2 year old, maybe a 3-year-old bald eagle, right? But that bird in the center is a 1-year-old, maybe 2-year-old golden eagle. The white in their plumage is very distinctly confined to 3 areas on its body: the base of the tail, and just inside of the primaries, there's a white patch on both wings. If you look at that third bird over on the right, that's another bald eagle. You can see there's a lot of white, but it's real diffuse. So it's not confined to just one specific area or 2 or 3 on the body. So that's eagles. Now, maybe that's not as much as you hoped for, but since we've got so much to cover, I'll suggest this to you. If there's a particular group that you're struggling with, I'm going to ask Sarah to give everyone my email address, and then you can email me if you have any other questions. So here's osprey, very distinctive silhouette, right? This kind of crooked wing, a lot of white underneath, especially in the body and the throat and the underwing, and then in part of the wing. But there are these dark areas at the bend of the wing and in the primaries, very distinctive. And then 2 ospreys in a nest over on the right there. So these are harriers, but they're all different plumages. Over on the left, that's an adult male, kind of pearl gray, got real inky black wing tips and the trailing edges of the secondaries. The bird on the bottom in the center is another one of those male gray harrier adults. You can see that bird and the bird to its right have these very distinctive white rump patches. The bird in the upper right is a just hatched this year immature bird, and its body plumage is all cinnamon colored. So as soon as that bird is 1 year old, it loses that coloration and it's never going to get it back, whether it's a male or a female. Bird in the lower right is an adult female. So the males are gray, the females are brown. There are 4 common buteos. Why do I have all these buteos here? Well, this is like most of the buteos you can see in the United States. Sometimes we'll get a rare one, but it sure doesn't happen very often. So I would never advise you to go out thinking you're going to see a rare buteo in Wisconsin. It just doesn't happen very often. Thus, that's the reason why we call them rare. So this is by far the most kind of common hawk and common plumage in a hawk that you're likely to see anywhere in Wisconsin. If you look at that bird on the left, this is a bird that is like less than 1 year, maybe less than 15 months old. The tail isn't red, but it is a red tail. But it's got these very distinctive, what are called carpal bars. That's the leading edge of the wing, just either side of the head, right? In any normally plumaged red-tailed hawk, that's the first thing that you want to look for. There's this patch of kind of diffuse dark markings across the belly that some people refer to as a belly band. Well, it's true that most red-tails display that, but not everyone. So you'll see in fall some occasional red tails that are visiting us from the southwestern United States that we call Fuertes subspecies. They can lack that belly band completely, and the whole breast and belly looks completely white. But this is kind of typical, right? And if you look just again inside the primaries, right where the secondaries start on either wing, there's this translucent panel. Sometimes people call it like a rectangular panel. It doesn't look very rectangular on this bird, but you can see that there's some light coming through there. So those translucent panels are commonly seen as well. So the carpal bar, you can see the red arrow pointing to it, and the belly band are both really obvious in this Sibley drawing. Although the belly band is not on every red tail, the carpal bar is, and should be one of the first field marks you look for on buteos in flight. Now, somebody will throw me a curveball and say, well, will you see that carpal bar on an albino red tail? Probably not, but there aren't very many of those either. So here are adult red tails. I mean, most birders can recognize this as a red-tailed hawk. Very distinctive rufous red tail. Again, these birds all have that belly band and you know, kind of barring on the primaries and secondaries. You can see some barring in the reddish tail on that bird on the far left. If you look all the way to the right, those two birds, they don't display that barring in the tail feathers very clearly when you're seeing it from above. But if you had the bird like right next to you, if a hawk bander had it and was showing it to you, you could look at those tail feathers and you would see that barring is there too. So when you see a hawk in flight, a big broad-winged hawk like this, these are the things that I suggest to you should look for first. This light section, again, this translucent panel, this dark carpal bar on either side of the head, and if the bird is an adult, the tail should be red. However, every once in a while, nature throws us a curveball. Here's a dark morph red-tailed hawk, and if you saw this bird and you hadn't watched hawks for a long time, you might really be confused by this bird. But it is most definitely a red tail. It's just a dark morph. Red-tailed hawks are so variable in their plumage. I could show you like 50 different pictures of different color morph and age classes, and every one would be different from the one before. There are many immature redtails every autumn because they have not attained adult plumage yet. So again, remember to look for that carpal bar. Most of them will have a belly band, but the tail on immature birds is not red, and it often has these bars and streaks. So here are birds that you could see this time of year that are visiting us from the Arctic. On the far left, that's an adult male rough-legged hawk. In the center, that's a female. And on the far right is a dark morph rough-leg. If that bird is perched, you wouldn't see very much white on it unless you were looking from the back. And then the white would only be visible in the base of the tail, because the upper surface of this bird and much of the lower surface is very dark. I would say you could call it chocolate brown, but sometimes it's actually black, right? Here are Sibley's drawings of rough legs. See the dark primary tips, the dark carpal mark at the bend of the wing, and then the more subtle differences is the amount of dark on the belly and the breast. Strongest on the immature bird to the far left, it's bird A. It shows a kind of a grayish but not black subterminal band on the tail. B is an adult female, has a lot more dark all the way from the throat all the way down to the feet, and kind of dark markings on the tail. And then if you go all the way to the right, bird C is an adult male. The adult male has a darker breast than the female, and a darker, the breast is darker than the belly, but it's kind of subtle. And if the bird's just flying by you, you might not have time to assess all of those different things. So here's certainly our most colorful buteo, red-shouldered hawk. All three of these birds are adults. You know, they have this kind of rusty, barred breast and belly, very beautiful color. And then if the bird is perched like that bird on the left, you see where the name comes from, the red shoulder, and you can see that on the bird on the far right, the red shoulder shows up again on the upper surface of the bird. This bird is a little smaller than a red tail, usually, but there can be a little bit of overlap in size. So adult bird on the left, when you see it over you, you see all these contrasting dark and light bands on the tail. And an immature bird, maybe less than a year old, is over on the right. You see these big, kind of what some people refer to as halberd-shaped markings against the white background, the dark markings against the white background. That's very distinctive on those immature. So if you were to look at red shoulders through, like from starting out juvenile plumage through an immature plumage into adults, again, you can kind of see this from left to right. The leftmost bird is that immature plumage bird, and you can see that kind of diffuse spotting on the breast, a little bit less on the belly. There's a few things to look for on each one of these birds. Just inside the dark primary tips is the translucent area again. Some people say it's shaped like a comma. It's not like the translucent area on a red tail. It's kind of elongated, and it's only maybe an inch and a half wide. On the adult, right, you can see both of the two middle birds there, that very strongly contrasting dark and white bands in the tail. That's very distinctive. That third bird, right, third from the left, is what a red shoulder looks like from above. So there's kind of these alternating light and dark feathers in the secondaries and primaries as well, right? makes the bird look kind of zebra striped-ish because those feathers are all dark and light. And the translucent comma is still visible. Again, if the sun is behind the bird, that really stands out. Of course, that doesn't happen every day when the sun's not strongly shining. And then another immature bird on the far right-hand end. If you were to compare these two medium-sized buteos, here's a study skin of red-shouldered hawk on the left, broad-winged hawk on the right. Yes, they are that much different in size. Red tail would be even a little bit bigger on average than the red shoulder. So if you had a red tail over on the left, far left, it would be even a little bigger than this red-shouldered hawk here. So one thing that you may notice here is comparatively, the red-shouldered hawk's tail feathers are pretty long, whereas the broad-winged hawk's tail feathers are rare, very short by comparison. So now and then in fall, probably less often in spring, although we do see it happen from time to time, you'll see this formation of hawks flying kind of slowly circling. We call it a kettle. Sometimes it can include thousands of birds. If you went to Hazel-Bazemore State Park in southern Texas at the end of September, and you were there on the right day, you could see kettle after kettle after kettle until maybe 75,000 birds had gone by you. And nearly all of them would be broadwings. Although in Texas, there you start getting a few other species mixed in. You'll once in a while see swallow-tailed kite or a Swainson's hawk or a bunch of red tails or a few turkey vultures mixed in, but the vast majority of the birds in that kettle will be broadwings. So what they're doing is they're catching a hold of a thermal bubble of warm air that's lifting them aloft. And if they just keep circling, they can go for many, many, many miles without expending a lot of effort. It really helps them to assist their migration. So here's broadwing. Again, it's got that dark and light contrasty tail feathers, but those tail feathers are shorter. This is a smaller bird, remember, and the bird to your lower left there is facing us. That too is an adult. You can see that kind of rusty patches against the light in that bird. Well, here are accipiters, right? We have 3 of them. And most years, especially in migration, the vast majority, 95%, will consist of 2 of those birds, sharp-shinned hawk and Cooper's hawk. So if you were, let's say you were having a really good day at the hawk watch, there were lots of hawks. It's the 3rd weekend in September, and maybe that day you saw 1,200 hawks, right? And mixed in, there'd be a bunch of red tails, a few kestrels, other things like that, a few other falcons. But probably of that 1,200 birds, 900 of them would be sharp-shinned. Maybe 250 of them would be Coopers, but only 2 or 3 would be goshawks, and that's even in a good year. And most of the time, you don't start to expect goshawks until the tail end of October and even into November. So they don't start migrating until long after these other 2 species have passed through and are completely gone from Wisconsin. And some years, you won't see any goshawks at all. So here's a side-by-side comparison of all 3 of those birds in immature plumage. And this really gives you a great idea of the relative size of these 3 species. The bird on the far left is a sharp-shinned. In the middle is the Cooper's hawk. In the far right, that's a goshawk. So look at the head of that Sharpie on the far left. You can see that the head does not extend past the leading edge of the wings, right? on the Cooper's hawk in the middle, it's got kind of a tubular shaped body, somewhat longer body. And then the goshawk is just more bulky, has really dark streaking, and the streaking stands out much more on those birds than it does on the other two species. So here are Sharpies. There's an adult on the left. The plumage of adult sharp-shinned hawks and Cooper's hawks is very similar, but there are some subtle things to point out to you. So there's an immature Sharpie on the right. Notice that these birds have a kind of a dark gray crown that kind of fades into the back of the nape of the neck. When I show you the next slide, you'll see that a Cooper's hawk, the cap is very distinctively darker than the rest of the plumage on the head, right? These birds, again, are much smaller than the Coopers, but there's a little bit of overlap. You could have kind of a smallish male Cooper's hawk and kind of a big female sharp-shinned hawk, and they could approach being close to each other in size. Here's the coop. You see that dark cap on that bird in the upper left there. That cap is so distinctively darker on the adults than it is in any of the rest of these three. Because Cooper's hawks are now common breeding species in suburbia, you can see individuals like this moving around any day of the year, and they may not be migrating. They're just looking for birds at people's feeders. So one of the things that early field guides often pointed out, you see that kind of image of three birds against the blue sky there. That kind of shows you what we used to point out about Cooper's hawks, that they had this kind of rounded end of the tail. Well, that's not very reliable, because you can see a bird perched off on the right here, this immature coop. Its tail doesn't look rounded at the tip at all, right? It looks kind of square. So I would never rely on that to help you tell the two species apart. So here are the big guy, goshawk, an adult over on the right, immatures on the left, both above and below. You'll notice these immature birds have a yellow iris, and when the bird becomes an adult, that color turns red, right? So that's not something that usually most of us get to see very often. So if you want to look for a little bit more about this bird, you can look for my article on goshawks in the fall 2021 issue of Birdwatching magazine. I go much more into detail about these. So again, those very dark streaks on the breast, that's visible in both the upper and the lower picture on the left. That white bird, Carl Schwartz and I were just talking about this not long ago. The undertail coverts, the fluffy feathers between the feet and the base of the tail, are really like exquisitely fluffy. And sometimes when that bird takes off, you'll see like that area of plumage just fluffs out in the wind, being caused by the bird in flight. But that's not something that you get to see very often, right? Unless you really study goshawks and go and make a point of watching them a lot. So falcons are the next group, very, very different from the previous group. The most numerous falcon we have is the American kestrel. Then the medium-sized one is the Merlin, and the bigger, the star of the group that takes all of the air out of any other conversation about raptors is the peregrine. We do occasionally get a gyrfalcon in Wisconsin. Maybe there's 2 or 3 seen like every 2 years, right? Somewhere in the state. They're not reliably sighted here. Sometimes it's a little cluster of birds in the far northwest near the city of Superior. Sometimes there are one or two seen at hawk watches, but it's not a bird that you can depend on. Prairie falcon is even rarer. So there's only maybe 8 or 9 or 10 accepted sightings from the whole state for prairie falcon. Why that is, I'm not really sure, because there are some seen in Illinois every year. It just seems their southward migration takes in part of Illinois more reliably than it does in Wisconsin. So here are peregrines from left to right. Immature birds, the best one you can see that's well defined is that second one from the left. Again, very dark streaking on the breast and the belly. That bird farthest to the left is an adult. You can see this area of white on the chest and the throat. It's so contrasty, it really stands out. You know, there are subtle color morph designations of peregrines if you go from east to west across the country. If you were watching hawks in the Pacific Northwest, you might see a really, really dark, what's called Peel's peregrine there, but that's not a bird we're likely to see in the Midwest. So again, adult on the far left, and these other three birds to the right are all in a kind of a continuum of whether they're like juvenile birds. That bird in the top right there is probably a bird that's less than 1 year old. Similar, that one in the far lower right, and really strong, this bird in the center in the lower part here, looking right at us, that really gives you a good flavor of how dark that streaking is on the breast. That helmet, it's got lots of different names, you know, depending on who you're talking to. And remember, again, when you are hanging around with people who've been studying hawks or maybe flying hawks for a long time, you'll notice that there's all this kind of archaic language that comes to us all the way from the Middle Ages, because people have been practicing falconry for going on 3,000 years now. And a lot of that old-fashioned language is always brought in whenever you're talking about falcons. Here's Merlins, our medium-sized falcon, right? Very strong, very contrasty, dark and light bands transverse across the tail, both in immature birds and adults, right? This bird that's like fourth from the left is a really good example of an adult with some streaking, but again, it's kind of a little bit lighter on the breast and the throat. That bird farthest to the right is an example of immatures. So, you know, there are like 4 or 5 races or subspecies of Merlins. The one in the upper left here is a prairie Merlin. That's the one that we're probably likely to see a lot of the time. That's an adult male. These two other birds are females. So again, similar to, remember what we talked about, the harrier, the adult males are gray, the adult females are brown, right? Very distinctively so. So we used to have really good flights of Merlins along the shores of the Great Lakes. That seems to be breaking up a little bit, that pattern. So here are kestrels, again, adult male on the far left, the bird A there, the immature bird next to it, and then the adult bird is also the third bird, right, from the left, and the immature bird in fourth position. But these latter two birds you're seeing from the upper surface. So male on the far upper left there, very distinctive with those two contrasty bars on the face, the kind of rusty red plumage on the back and the upper part of the tail, and then this slate gray plumage on the upper surface of the wing. In the lower center, you see an adult female. So she lacks that gray coloration that the female has, or rather that the male has. And you can see another male on the far right. I have to say that photograph, to me, is one of the absolute best photographs of a kestrel that I've ever seen, and I always include it in these presentations for that reason. It's just a spectacularly colored, really amazing small falcon. So here are some books that, you know, depending on how far you want to get into studying raptors, I recommend at least one of these, right? The oldest one is far on the left, the one by Pete Dunn, Dave Sibley, and Clay Sutton called Hawks in Flight. There's now a second edition available. I learned a ton from studying that book and all of its various versions and all the drawings, really excellent drawings. The middle book and the book on the far right don't have drawings, they have photographs. These are books by Jerry Liguri, who's a really expert hawk watcher. And when you first buy a copy of this book, either one of these books, you might be disappointed because it doesn't show really large, detailed pictures of any one of these species. Instead, it shows small photographs of the birds off in the distance, which is exactly the way you see them in real life. So any one of these books is highly recommended. This is kind of the example of what you see in Hawks from Every Angle and Hawks at a Distance. You might think at first, that's not going to help me, but if you study both of these books, you will really learn a lot more about identifying hawks in flight. So how do we conduct a raptor watch, right? When we set aside time to do this and choose a location, it has to be the right kind of geography, and I'll go into that. You want to go out when the weather conditions are appropriate. That's getting a little bit more complicated and really sometimes very frustrating. You want to do some data gathering and have a well-organized data sheet, because if you're gathering all these numbers, you should have a purpose in mind for doing this kind of, you know, it's a certain amount of effort that you're going to put into it. So what do you want to do with your data? Well, you should give it to the Hawk Migration Association of North America, because they're really using it for all of the studies of all of these birds to learn more about their populations and hopefully to do conservation for them. So here's what we know about the geography of some Midwestern raptor concentrations. If you go all the way to the far northwestern corner of Wisconsin, right across the border into Minnesota at Duluth there's Hawk Ridge. They get fantastic numbers of raptors there every fall. We used to have a raptor watch and banding station near Little Swamico on the bay side of Green Bay. That's not really in operation anymore. Then, you know, raptors follow these leading lines of these coastlines, like the very, very clearly marked western side of Lake Michigan. But they also, the same thing holds true if you go across the state of Michigan to the east side of Michigan, and where Lake Huron and Lake Erie come together. That is also a tremendous place, these lakeshore points, for seeing raptors during migration. So it's really, really a great place. Any one of those places is really good for that. Join Kate Redmond from the Observatory in fall at Forest Beach Migratory Preserve for their raptor counts. If you've ever done that, you're very familiar with that Hawk Watch platform that's pictured on the left there. You can learn more about raptor migration through the Hawk Migration Association go to their website. It's hmana.org. Really fantastic organization that I strongly recommend you study with them, and perhaps you might feel like you want to join that organization. That would really be a good thing. So again, if you've read Kate Redmond's fall 2023 report from the Forest Beach Hawk Watch in the recent LMBO newsletter, you'll have noticed that what we used to think of as formerly consistent conditions seem to be changing. And it's kind of given us some trouble. We're trying to figure it out, but we haven't really figured it out as yet. We used to say that raptor movement along the Lake Michigan shoreline was best on a northwest wind. That was like the mantra that we repeated over and over for 50 years. We also said that raptor movement was likely to be poor on south or southeast winds. What's kind of shocked us is that neither of these statements still seem to be completely true, and there might be multiple causes for this. At the scale of our southeastern Wisconsin landscape, so if you look at like 1820 counties in the southeastern quarter of the state, wind patterns and currents that always kind of shape the way we witness migration, some of those things may be changing. Again, not at the scale of a single site, but the scale of a much larger area of geography. For birds like goshawk, we always thought, and there were papers written about this, how goshawks seem to have a 10-year cycle. Well, that seems to be breaking down because I don't see any strong evidence of it since the turn of the 21st century. I can remember seeing big goshawk flights in 1982 and again in 1992, but certainly not in 2002 or 2012. Now, maybe some other watchers have still continued to see that, but it doesn't seem like it's as strongly there of a consistent condition as it once was. So it's something we're trying to understand. Can't say that we've gotten very far with that yet. For several Midwestern raptor species, the Federal Breeding Bird Survey shows declines in Wisconsin and the Midwest and in the bird conservation region that we live in. But because raptor migration is so weather dependent, we should probably not base our understanding of changes in the population on less than 10 years of data. So here's a little bit more on declines of birds. We know that 49%, it's a huge percentage of bird species around the world have declining populations. Now, does that mean that they're becoming extinct? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying as a population, you could look at American kestrel population in North America, and in many parts of the continent, they seem to be undergoing a decline. Well, here are a list of stresses on globally threatened birds all over the world. Ecosystem conversion and degradation is really a huge one. Direct mortality, which can result from all kinds of different sources. Collision, feral cats, predation by bigger species, illness, too heavy of a parasite load. So you can go on describing all these sources of direct mortality. Reduced reproductive success is an important one, and that shows up in a lot of these species that are declining. But again, do we completely understand what is reducing their reproductive success? We understand partially, but not completely. Disturbance during the nesting season is another huge one. So, you know, if you know somebody who has a raptor nest on their property, probably not a cool idea to spend a lot of the time getting real close to the tree that that nest is in during the breeding season, because you can potentially disturb them to the extent that the adults will leave. And then there's no reproduction for that year. Competition between species, that seems to be a factor in some of these cases as well. Kind of an indirect ecosystem effect. There's a long laundry list of that, and hybridization, that too. But as you can see, compared to these other sources of stresses, that it's not a huge one. So here's a great example of a bird that's doing fantastically well in Wisconsin. If you go back to the 1950s, when I started watching birds, you had to go to the northern counties of the state to see a nesting osprey. And they were not doing well. There weren't very many pairs, right? But because we have much better legal protection of them, and we have removed a source of their decline, which was in the 50s, it was pesticides. We've kind of removed some of those sources of population effect. Now, you know, if you look at that map on the far lower right there, that's the more recent atlas map from the second atlas. That shows that we now have ospreys breeding in about 58, 59, 60 counties of the state, which hasn't been true in, I would say, almost 175 years. So is the species improving? It's doing great. Here's Cooper's hawk. This is another, again, we removed the pesticide that was causing the problems, and it's just been an upswing in population, not stopping, it's still going strong. And Cooper's hawks are breeding in far more places in the state than they were 100 years ago, for example. Here's a different sort of way of looking at that kind of data. This is data from the Christmas bird count. And again, you can see that graph just going up and up and up on the right. So we've got a lot more Cooper's hawks in the state in winter than we did years ago also. Here's the situation for kestrel. You can see that it's the opposite kind of a picture, right? The trend is downward. And just for comparison, I suggest you to look at that graph on the right-hand side. That's the graph of downward trajectory for the Eurasian kestrel, which is a very closely related species. Doesn't look exactly like ours. So slightly bigger, but it's very similar ecology, very similar kind of life history. So there's something happening with these birds all around the world and to multiple species, especially these closely related species. So here's the lead-in title page of an article. The title is Combining Migration and Wintering Counts to Enhance Understanding of Population Change in a Generalist Raptor Species, the Red-tailed Hawk. So I strongly recommend reading this paper if you're interested in that kind of thing. It was published in February of 2017 in the journal Ornithological Applications. So really smart people working on all this data and trying to kind of tease apart some of these factors. Red-tailed hawks at Forest Beach Migratory Preserve since 2009. I have to say this really isn't a long enough time series to show much of a trend. You can see if you look on the field one across the horizontal axis, 2010, 2012, and 2014, the Raptor Watch wasn't very active that fall. So we didn't have very many numbers to compare. So we need to stay at this for 20 or 30 years to really be able to say something based on our data there. Here's a data sheet, you know, kind of typical data sheet. If you've done hawk watching at our hawk watch, this is the one we use. if you're going to start your own hawk watch, we can send you one of these and you can just make copies. So if you plan to do your own hawk watch, you should get one of these. If you plan to do the Forest Beach watch, you should have one of these if you start before September 1st. After that date, Kate will have some of these in a plastic bin and clipboard on the Forest Beach Hawk Watch platform. Here's something about the Hawk Migration Association. Again, I can't say enough about this organization. They're really doing great work. We've got colleagues all over the Midwest and the West who are just doing a tremendous job gathering more data about raptors and learning more about their ecology. And then hopefully we're going to turn all that into conservation. So here are some good raptor watch locations where we've had a raptor watch at least sometimes in the past. Sometimes they haven't continued though. Squamigan Bay up in on the border between Ashland and Bayfield County, that's a fantastic one, but they don't seem to be doing it anymore. Likewise, they seem to be doing less hawk watching at Woodland Dunes. You'd have to talk to the people up there and see what they've got going on from year to year. At Cedar Grove, we've got one of the absolute best hawk watching locations in the entire world. They started this way back in the 1940s and kind of have an unbroken set of data continuing from then until now. So a number of different people have been leading the Cedar Grove hawk banding station. They do fantastic work that's produced dozens and dozens of scientific papers over the years. Really an incredible place. Again, Forest Beach, which you know we've been talking about, and Concordia, somewhere to the south of us, another maybe 9 miles south of us, something like that. We had great hawk watching being done there from the 80s into the early 2000s. It isn't as reliably done every year in recent years as it was. I'm not saying that they're not doing it at all. They just don't seem to be doing it as much as they were. And then far west in Grant County along the Mississippi is Eagle Valley, which is another fantastic place to watch raptors in fall migration. So they too have done amazing work there over the years. So other places in the Midwest, in case you want to go traveling and see what they've got, some other place, Hawk Ridge in Duluth, it's just a fantastic place. Whitefish Point in the far eastern end of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Again, Whitefish Point Bird Observatory is a fantastic place. The time to see raptors there is really in the spring more than it is in the fall. It's just a function of how the migration operates there. And then south of us, across the border into Illinois, the Illinois Beach State Park Hawk Watch is another really excellent group of people who've been at this for quite a while now. They stick with this consistently, and they've done a really great job over the years. So can you start your own raptor watch? Yeah, I would say you could with some qualifiers. So the geography should be right, and then you should go out there beforehand and try to see if there's kind of regular or repeated movement of raptors at the new site. So that's what I have for tonight. You've got some questions, now would be a good time. We still have a couple minutes left in this hour, so go ahead.
Yeah, feel free if you have questions to just unmute yourself.
You said you were recording this. Will we be able to see it again on our own? How can we do that?
Yes, I can email everybody with a link to our YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I was at Forest Beach for Treasures of Oz this year. I can't remember the exact date. Went there fairly early in the morning. I think it was like around 7:30 or so. Oh, it was unbelievable, amazing how many birds. You know, there was a very strong wind from the north, and I mean the sky was just filled with hawks. It was unbelievable. But then a few hours later, I was at Vermont Park, which is also on the lake shore, around noon, and there wasn't a bird in the sky. The
Right,
wind had died down a bit, but I mean, there was still a bit of a breeze. So is it the time of day or is it something else? Or just curious about that.
If I could tell you definitively an answer to that question, a lot of people would want to talk to me, right? Because we don't really know the answer to that, right? It can change in 30 minutes, right? To where you're just surrounded by birds. 30 minutes later, the wind's blowing the same. There's still the same amount of clouds in the sky, and there's nothing, right? We will probably never really understand that completely. We're working to understand it, but if I tried to tell you an answer today, someone else would have to point out, well, Bill is lying to you because he doesn't really know what he's talking about. More questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So,
All right, well, if
Sarah,
any-
how are we doing?
We are doing great. If nobody else has any questions, then thank you everybody for coming. If you think of questions after we are done, please feel free to email us at info@lmbo.org and we can connect you with Bill and he can answer anything you'd like to talk about.
Or at least try.
Right?
Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you everyone very much. I hope you have a great night and we'll hopefully see you next month.